Hi guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lefarius, and in this week's episode, which is number 56, we are going to be taking a look at Road Rash. But as always, before we dive into that, let's just have a look at some of this week's news. First of all, I would just like to take a moment to send out a huge thanks to kkbigal, who also has a YouTube channel. Basically, I've had all sorts of problems getting a few games to run on emulators just to record footage with, and I was trying desperately to get it working. I was talking to him on Twitter, and he's offered to provide some footage for me to use. So today's Road Rash footage is all from his channel, so a huge thank you to him. Sadly, this has happened a couple of times in the show's history. It's usually when there's a really interesting game that I want to cover and I just can't get any decent footage for it, and I always need to provide like gameplay footage to go along with what we're actually playing, so at least you guys are convinced that, you know, we are actually playing the game. But when this stuff happens, it's great that there's people in the community that will jump in and help out. Now, next up is something I saw over on indieretronews.com. There's a brand new Amiga game come out called Redpill Puzzle Move the Diamonds by Lemming880, which is a diamond moving puzzle game in which you need to move the coloured diamonds around a maze into the grey coloured squares to win the level. I was watching this a bit on YouTube. It does look quite interesting actually. It's like that old sort of box pushing puzzle. Is that like, it's not Sudoku, is it? That old Japanese game. Anyway, I'm going way off track there. Has some fantastic music in it, nice bright colourful graphics, very blue, did look absolutely amazing, so well worth checking out, and as usual I will stick a link into the show notes. Next up, this is going back several months, but there was talk of a CD32 third-party controller, which was by KTRL CD32. He basically had printed these SNES controllers, and they're all black and very flush and look very, very nice with a usual cable coming out of the back of it. He's gone back to the drawing board, and his actual diagrams of this and pictures of stuff he's actually done, and he's managed to convert this into a wireless pad. Now, this absolutely blew me away when I saw it, because again, you know, this is Amiga tech mixed with something modern to make something new, and from all reports it looked really, really good. He's only doing these in a limited number, I think because it takes so much work to do them, but if you're interested or want one, this news came out back in early October, so I'm a bit late as usual. That's just my style. Sorry guys, what can I say? But anyway, I'll post a link into the show notes. It's well worth going a look on there. It's over on the EAB boards and well worth checking out. It's always great that people sink so much time into these projects. I must miss loads and loads of them. I've always got my eye on the news just to see what's coming out, but to see things like this, and you've got stuff like PCB boards and card reprints and re-engineered, I don't know, Amiga cases, like the case like the A1500 recently. Amazing stuff going on out there, and it's a very, very active community for us Amiga fans. It's time to rev up into this week's game. Stop groaning in the back. Road Rash. Now, this is something I'm very familiar with. As a kid, it was one of those Sega Mega Drive games that I was absolutely addicted to. I think it was the marketing at the time and just how many people played it and were really excited about getting something like this. Very, very strange for a racing game, effectively. This one, though, was very different because it had combat in. It just wasn't something you saw from these types of games. Up until now, they've been very boring and bland, and there was nothing you could really do beyond racing to the finish line. But Road Rash completely changed that, and it was something you could play with other people and have a lot of fun with, and all the different things that happen. And I had no idea that there was actually a Amiga version of it, so I was quite intrigued going back to this and thinking, well, just how is it going to compare to the Mega Drive version? So let's find out. Now, first up, it was published by Electronic Arts, as I'm sure you already know. They've done games like Battle Chess, Flood, and that's something we do need to tackle at some point. The Strike series, so Desert Strike, Jungle Strike, but no third one, remember. Neuromancer, it's something I really want to cover at some point. PGA Tour Golf, etc, etc. EA were huge and had their hands in so many pies. But sadly, as the console market was doing so well with them, especially with the Sega stuff, they sort of dropped Amiga support and moved away from computers and things, and what was once a huge massive publisher just became very small trickle at the end, sadly, and it's just a shame that some of the bigger titles never made it across. Anyway, it was developed by Peak Star. They made games like F1 World Champ, Moonshine Racers, Sooty and Sweep, that's definitely worth a look at, Thomas the Tank Engine 1 and 2. So this is a very strange game for them to side off into. I mean, I can sort of see it from the F1 World Champ game. I'm not sure what type of racer that is. If it's a behind the vehicle sort of one, maybe they were using the same engine. I'm not sure. Again, that's something I should have looked into. Now, this came out in 1992 on just 2 floppy disks. And it was for 2 players with a price of £25.99. There was only a single coder for this, and he was called Pete Hickinson, who had worked on games like Blasteroids, Chase HQ, Chubby Gristle, I think that was a Spectrum game originally, Continental Circus, Monsters, I'm not sure, is that off the TV show? I'm not sure, and Moonshine Racers as well, and I think he did loads of different games, mostly across EA sort of titles. The graphics were drawn by Mark Edwards. Again, he did games like Chase HQ, Chubby Gristle, sort of team these guys, F1 World Champ, Laser Squad, Shadow Warriors, loads and loads of different games. The music was done by Jason A.S. Whiteley. He also did Strike Fleet, Space Hulk, John Madden and Desert Strike. That's quite a good choice of spin-off games there off the back of that. That's probably why they were involved with this one. This was a bit of a tough one to find out the history for, because this was solely a Mega Drive game during its development, and it was later ported over to the Amiga, so we're just really going to cover the general history of it as a game, and there isn't that much detail to do with the console port, I'm sad to say. Now, it started out as a NES game called Mario Andretti Racing. Now, this was a sim-based racer. There was nothing special about it. It was your typical behind the vehicle racer. Now, Dan Geisler came along as the lead programmer, and he thought the game was very boring, so he started pushing for something new and wanting to develop this into something completely different. He was a bike rider himself, and after a trip along Mulholland Drive, which is over in the US, I think that is that maybe around San Francisco, I don't know, I'm going off my terrible movie knowledge. But during an incident on the actual bike where he had a very near miss, he sort of saw himself as being wiped out and getting close to getting serious. Here it comes, Road Rash. Now that sparked an idea, and when he came back he started developing a bit further, and that's how Road Rash came about. For a long time during development it was actually called Road Rash on Mulholland Drive. Everyone kept shortening it to Road Rash though, and after a while during the development that name stuck and they just completely dropped the Mulholland Drive spin-off, which is a good thing really if you think about it. From the beginning though, it was actually being developed on the NES, but it became apparent as they were going through that they needed something to take advantage of the power of like the Sega Genesis Mega Drive, so they decided to switch development and it completely changed and they dropped the 8-bit version. In a previous job, Dan Geisler had mapped out a full city of San Francisco, and the game's tracks within Road Rash actually became based around this initially. They didn't use that for the final version, they would later go on to use loads of different California locations just because there's more of a mixed environment around there and they could do more to develop the tracks and stuff. But it was impressive they were actually using his pre-map stuff to come up with a game design effectively, and he was coming up with all these great ideas. I'm surprised he was only like the lead programmer and not something more. There was another guy involved called Randy Breen who was responsible converting all of the driving graphics, actually pushing the game to add hills and bumps rather than just be a flat straight racing affair. Think the likes of Hang On and Super Monaco GP, that sort of stuff. It was quite common at the time for these racing games to all be very similar. And if you think about it, Road Rash is essentially Sega's Hang On turned up to 11, but they were limited with what they could do, especially at this time. Sadly, they were only given 11 months to actually develop the game, and they really did come up with something special considering all these different aspects that they were able to push and mesh together to make it all work. One of the game's biggest aspects, I said earlier, was the fighting and the way you could scrap with other bikers and knock them off, and the marketing department for EA were not on board with that idea at all, especially considering what was going on at the time and the way everything was pushed towards like games are more for kids and not for grown-ups or anything like that. Yet Sega was pushing down that route of, we're for the teens and into the 20s, the cooler crowd. So it was lucky that they were able to keep that as an actual aspect, and that was kept because of Dan, who was able to argue to be able to have some artistic license to develop the game in the way he wanted. One of the funniest things I did discover in one of the interviews is that Dan actually approached a policeman, an actual real life policeman, and asked him if he'd agreed to pose for some photographs next to his bike. This is an official police bike over in the US, and they just didn't mind, and the cop was quite cheerful about it, and he let them use that as a design, and they went on to push that during all the cop races and stuff. That's the guy you're actually seeing. You don't see his face or anything, they don't have gone that far. The fact that you could go to someone in real life for a simple game like that and not need all these disclosures or rights to sign stuff and appearances away, it was a very different time. These days you'd probably be paying an absolute license fee fortune just to get something like that done. This isn't your typical racing game. It has these weird fighting elements which just weren't being done anywhere else, and the teams involved in actually building the game were a strange mix of simulation racers and arcade action types, and I think that's when that all came together. That's why they got it working to the degree so well of what it actually came to be, because their philosophy would have that serious edge with a bit of fun, cheeky fighting, scrapping added to the bit, and then you've got the arcade style controls mixed in, and it comes up with a very interesting pot. And they must have done incredibly well because the game was so popular that it ended up having several sequels. Now, sadly, the only 2 sequels that came to the Amiga were the first 2 games, but there were things like the 3DO versions, later PlayStation and stuff. They really went overboard with a number of different games you could get with this. As a side note, Sega Power magazine actually produced a Road Rash novel, which I believe was written by the editor at the time. I think it was Andy Green, I might be off there. I have actually read this to some degree. I was a big fan of it when I got it as a magazine plugin. Is that the right word for it? Or attachment plugin? What am I going on about? It was an extra anyway with the magazine. They did a full series of these with things like Desert Strike. I think Golden Axe was mixed in there, and possibly Super Monaco GP. It was a very funny time at the beginning of the 90s, but it turned out it was actually quite a fun story, and it's only about 90 pages long, and you can pick it up for next to nothing, and I would recommend you do so because it's actually really good. Now, it was ported to the 3DO, Game Boy, later Game Boy Color, Sega Game Gear, Sega Master System. That's very important as a game because no one at the time, this is something I played when I used to have a Master System collection. It's very impressive, the sort of 3D and the speed of it. It's not something a Master System should be capable of doing, but it's on there and it looks great. Mega Drive, Sega Genesis, that was the main version. Sega's Mega/Sega CD system, later on the Sega Saturn, and finally the PS1. There has of course been talk of sequels to the Road Rash franchise for years upon years, and there's been various different videos and design concepts, but sadly nothing has ever come to the fore. There's been a few attempts, I think, to put it into 3D. I do not think that will work because the joy of Road Rash is you need to be behind it. It needs to have that feel of the old classic racer, and I know we've left all them 2D graphics behind, but I think you could still do a slight view of that behind the car. It could even be a slight angle if you want to get fancier, and then mix in some of the 3D, like with the hills and the environments and things. I think it'll work pretty well. Or is that just me being a bit of a nut because I'm too much of a retro gamer? In typical racing fashion, there's not really a story to this. It just goes on about you racing across the California, is it the Outback? I don't know what you call it. Anyway, the idea is you just racing to become the #1 road rasher, win lots of points and prizes. However, between each of the races, you do actually get a bit of a comment or quote from the other racers on the track. It's usually very basic, it's only a paragraph long, but it adds to this feeling of being a bit of cheeky fun and pushing through the races and beating the other people. Now, this is a super hang-on style behind the bike racer. A quarter of the screen is dedicated to your information. This actually shows like a bike readout or set of dials along the bottom. The dials show things like speed, then you've got your position, the energy bars for yourself and other bike, i.e. racers, as you're following them along. And as another extra, there's also names of everybody else that you approach. So if you've got Bob in front of you, you will see his name pop up with a little energy bar. Every time you hit him, it will reduce the energy bar. Very straightforward. There's nothing too different from the typical 2D racing game of this type. It looks very average and just like the others, but we'll get into that in a bit because it's not what it looks like. The aim of the game is nice and simple. You're just there to win races and rack up loads and loads of cash. Now, you can be caught by the cops who are driving around quite aggressively, and they will go for anybody on a bike that's racing along these roads. If they catch you, they will actually fine you, take money, and make you lose the race. So you always have to be moving. It's not just your standard racing game. There are 5 tracks to race on. These cover Sierra Nevada, Pacific Coast, Redwood Forest, Palm Desert, and Grass Valley. Each of course has lots of different buildings with obstacles that are related to where they actually are. Now, each of these tracks does have a very different look, as you can probably tell. Places like Redwood Forest have got, well, surprise surprise, trees in there, while the Palm Desert will have some sand and typical racing surrounds. Nothing too over the top or amazing. You're not like going to Mars or space. This is very reality based, you know, it's that sort of a look. All of the racers and bikes are drawn with these really nice big sprites. They are very well drawn and almost lifelike. I really did like the looks of these guys, especially when you were knocked off the bike. Yes, that can happen, and you will be sent flying, and you have to get up and run back to your bike, and your guy will actually run on the spot as he's moving. Of course, this is all in 2D. It's not this big fancy 3D effect or anything. but it works pretty well, and they really have gone overboard to make these riders look as realistic as possible. Now, there is an amazing 3D effect, sort of, where if you hit a bump or an obstacle, you can take off at a short distance, jump through the air. If you're at a high speed, you will really cover a nice crazy distance, a big chunk of ground, and it really adds to this serious racer with this touch of fun. And it sort of happens as a surprise sometimes, because you can never really tell on occasion if you're going to be going fast enough to take off or get enough distance to be leaping through the air. Leaping's not the right word. It's very different to what I'm used to from this type of a racer, and it works pretty well. You can be knocked off, as I said before, but so can the enemies or the other racers. You can be driving along by kicking them, punching, or using a weapon. Fights can be pretty tough, and you really need to be careful that you don't lose too much time or distance if you knock them off their bikes, but the same does apply for them. You can be racing along quite happily beside somebody and just whip out a foot at the side or punch him off his bike, and if you're really lucky, it might knock him off his bike completely. If it doesn't, hit him a couple more times, and with any luck, he'll be sent sprawling on the ground, and then someone will always come up racing behind, try to gain his position. But usually if someone like that is knocked off the bike, it can be very tough for them to catch up with you quickly at all. The controls are quite simplistic. It's up to accelerate, down to brake. Fire will throw a punch or use a weapon if you've stolen one off somebody else. You can also use that to be driving along, whip out a punch, and then steal their weapon. In turn, you can then hit somebody round the back of the head with it. It's quite entertaining. If you press down and fire, you will do a kick off to the side. Now, this is quite nice, and it will take off a chunk of energy off the other person you hit, but you have to time it just right, because it can take a second or so more than the actual punch, because you're leaning your full weight off the bike, but it can be quite difficult to land these, and you've got to time it right. It's something you'll get used to as you're playing the game more and more. Add to that the ability to use the weapons and the ones that you snatch. It adds a real nice bit of combat variety. It makes it different than the competition in this sort of a game. It's a really neat thing to do. The weapons themselves are nothing too fancy. They don't go much beyond like bats or a chain that like whips out to the side. You can't be throwing objects off. It's nothing too complex like that. It's just neat little punching things. There's no guns or anything like that. This is all hand-on-hand violence. Well, that's probably a good thing, I'm glad to say. I will of course say that this does have a password save system, which in a way is a plus. At the same time though, we are using an Amiga, and it does seem a bit odd that you can't load anything to a floppy disk. Now, the actual passwords themselves tend to be multiple slots of like 4-digit codes, and they're not too annoying to type, but it can take more than your average simple password, and it's just annoying. Again, you've got that huge damn disk drive on the side of the machine. Why not just be able to stick a floppy in there and press save? So it's a bit annoying. Now, I did say earlier, you do get to earn cash by winning races, and it's always depending on your position how much you're actually going to get. You can use that money to buy better bikes for going around the tracks. Now, some of these are real demons. There's things like the Diablo 1000. That's the fastest bike in the game, and it will take you a lot of skill to get enough money to buy that one, and then when you do, you really need to play with it for a while to get used to how it responds along the tracks. It will take you ages. You could probably get some passcodes offline and try it yourself, but it's tough. You need to have been playing this game enough to know how to deal with the bike and react to situations and things, so it's not something for the faint of heart. Some of course are tough to control, even though they will have things like really high speed, and it just becomes a matter of trial and error as you go through these tracks, and you get the chance to try these different bikes over which you'll get used to and which you want to use on the type of track that you're actually on. All this talk of bikes does remind me that when you see the loading screen that pops up from time to time, it's always in between the tracks, you do get to see this really cute, that's such an odd thing to say, mini bike which comes driving across with a little rider on that just shows busy in the smoke of clouds behind him. It's a really neat bit of art, and I was looking at that thinking that's almost like an Amiga cursor. I'd love to be able to use something like that. Now, we should of course talk about the music, the awesome intro, which you will have heard earlier. I thought that was fantastic. You know, it's like a real guitar thrashing tune with loads of 90s attitude, and it matches the game perfectly. Now, each track does have its own music. This is always on loop, of course, because these are several minutes long for racing, but the fact that they've gone to this extent when lots of other Amiga games, especially racers, will not bother. I'm always grumbling about games not having music in sections where they should. Not with Road Rash, they've gone overboard. Sadly, the sound effects are a bit simplistic. There's nothing amazing here, I'm sad to say. They do match the game. You've got your metallic clunks and clicks and bangs and wallops as you're driving along. The engine noise is alright, it's nothing too amazing. I'm sad to say they could have done a lot more with this. Maybe if they'd sampled something off an actual motorbike, he could have gone and asked the actual copper who had the bike to just rev the engine a bit and he could have recorded it, but sadly there's just nothing like that there. It just left me wishing that they could have put a bit more sound effect variety in, because I don't think it would have taken much more effort. We should of course take a few moments to have a look at some of the game's problems. Like with all games, there's always some tucked away. Now, the first would have to be, there is a nice number of tracks to race along, but I would say I'd appreciate a few more. There's only 5 or 6 of them mixed in there. It's not a fantastic amount, and it's not like you can say race any in reverse, or there's extra parts of them like broken out into different sections. There's nothing special beyond the main tracks to go down. I would have liked a few more, even if they'd have done something like an updates disc later or something to expand with a couple more tracks. And then again, I suppose you just go and buy the sequel. It doesn't happen too often, but when it does, being thrown from the actual bike is quite annoying, as you do have to run back a fair old distance to mount your own bike. Now again, it doesn't happen all the time, and it depends on how fast you're going. If you're pelting along at full speed, and a lot of the time you will be, you can be sent absolutely miles down the road and you've got to run all that way back, and you will have to catch up quick to the other racers, because you know there's an effective time limit and you want to get there to get in first place. So I would say you need to stay on that bike for as long as possible, especially if you're in first place or aiming to get there to actually win. It's sort of a good thing in a way though that the same can happen to the other players, and some of the cheekier ones who have been coming at you for ages. It almost feels like you haven't, but it feels like some of them are your enemies, especially with the way the comments are between each of the races. You'd like that opportunity to knock them off and get a little bit of revenge, and it does have that in droves at least. There are points where you're in situations with them hitting and crashing against you and, you know, fighting back and forth. And a very annoying thing I discovered there was the sound effects will keep playing over and over and over again, depending on how many hits happen. And that really wouldn't be too bad in any normal game. But the thing with this is they haven't got a huge amount of crash noises or anything different. So it can just be the same effect playing like 3, 4, 5, 6 times, you know, like crash, 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 crash. And you just sit there and think, surely they could have come up with something a little bit different, even if they just mixed in a little echo to make it sound as if a different crunch was happening. It's very, very brief, and it only happens on rare situations, but when it does, it takes you out of the game a bit, and it's a little bit annoying. If you are into your sim racers, you aren't going to like this, because it's not on that level of what a sim racer would be, and you probably expect it with the way it looks. The controls are very arcade-like. It just won't appeal to that type of racer. Add in the fact you've got all the fun bits with the fighting, and it's always possible to go on these crazy jumps through the air. You know, gravity doesn't really matter. It doesn't destroy your bike when you land off the back of these jumps, which you might be expecting if you say you'd played something like Super Hang-On. I think is Super Hang-On the one where you can just blow up with a single hit? I'm not sure. That matches real life, I'm sure, but in a game like this, you want it to be unrealistic and to be able to have a bit of fun with it. Now, we've got to talk about the game's biggest problem. Despite having all these fancy fast bikes that you can buy later on in the game and really, really long tracks, it does feel like you're driving over sections of the US. it just feels a little slow. It does improve as you get the higher end bikes, but that in itself can take absolutely ages. I think like the Diablo costs like $10,000, or it might be 100,000. I might be thinking of the numbers wrong there, but that's not something you're going to achieve overnight. You're going to need several days of racing and coming back to different tracks to try and bump up first place and stuff, which is fine if you like that sort of thing. But the bit at the beginning where you will play the majority of the game, the speed just isn't there. And again, it is when you're on the better bike, so the game engine is capable of doing it. You just don't really see it when you should be doing. And I don't know if it's because they've limited the game in some way, or maybe it's to do with the engine. I just would have liked the opportunity to have a lot more speed up front, because you're on a super fast bike and it's doing whatever 200 miles an hour down this big stretch of road, and it just doesn't feel like it's moving fast enough to do anything interesting with. Lastly, the disc loading is awful. It takes ages between tracks. Luckily it doesn't pause the game halfway through whilst you're racing to load these sections, but you can be sat there for what feels like a lifetime just waiting for the floppy disk to roll over. Modern days it's not really going to be a problem because you're on an emulator, but even in the WHD Load Edition it does have these slightly overlong load times. I'm not sure what they could have done by that, but it just seems a shame that you try to push this super fast game and all these exciting things and you just hit this loading screen. And yeah, it's got the cute little mini bike on there, but that's not enough really, is it? It needed to be a bit faster. Let's have a look at the magazine scores. Now, Amiga Action gave this 80%, The One gave it 78%, CU Amiga 81%, Amiga Power 70%, and Amiga Format 84%. I think that's the highest. Of course, that's a very mixed bag of scores. I will say I can understand them though. Oh, I'm agreeing with the magazines. Now, the bike upgrades make the game and the races feel very unique. Once you become to the actual tracks and the obstacles that you're coming across, these obstacles are nothing, I didn't really go into them before. It's like oil on the floor and bits of rocks and trees. Nothing too amazing. They're just dotted around slightly in places. None of them cause a real problem to get round. You can often see it very obvious where they are. So you're always dependent on the tracks themselves, and the difficulty comes from working your way around them. Again, none of them are over the top. There's not lots of slipping and sliding and mega corners or anything like that, because they just look like roads. I guess it does capture the feeling of driving on actual roads pretty well. If you were doing this in real life, it's the sort of thing you'd be seeing all the time. Now, it can be very time consuming to earn enough cash to actually upgrade the bikes in between the races. It's not something you'll be able to do in like a single session or maybe in a week or so. You really do have to put some time and effort in this, and I can understand why they stuck in the password system. This is really something you need to focus on for a great deal of time. Now, fighting is a great part of the game. It can be very intense at points. When you're close to first place, there's no like rubber banding in something say like Mario Kart. I don't know why that always comes to mind when I think of combat games in racing. It does mean though that you really need to race hard to catch up to whoever's in first, and once you get there it's quite challenging. And as I said, there's no rubber banding. It's not like these spring off a bit behind and then come following you up really fast. No, all of the players have just as much, racers have just as much chance of catching you up as anyone at any position. There is a point in the races where if you're in say 5th or 6th, you're not going to win the race because there just isn't enough time and distance to get there. But if you're in 3rd or 4th and a good distance away, you can see at the bottom, there's a good chance you will get there if you drive well enough. And I think that's the sim part, and I can understand the sim programmers would have come up with this when they were designing that part. It works really well and I quite enjoyed that about it. Overall, this is a very fun game. It's oddly mellow. The combat, it's thrilling, it's exciting, and you have these nice long periods where you're just dawdling along. Again, the bikes don't go fast enough. The later ones do, the early ones don't, and it's a very odd mix, and you just think they could have just done a bit more. It just never gets fast enough unless you're on the later bikes. But again, unless you're going to sink all that time and effort in, you're really going to struggle with it. This does come very, very close to being quite a high scoring game in my books, because I did have a lot of fun with it and have a lot of fond memories of the original version. I can understand the mixed reviews that come from the magazines, the lack of speed and that push up the front really does affect the game and it just makes it miss the mark. But at the same time, you just think a bit more perfection, tightening things up, increasing that speed, adding on to that fun, it would have just been perfect. We could have had a really amazing game. I think I said in the history they wanted to make this like Hang On, to tackle that sort of a thing, you know, take that game's crown, and they almost come close. They've done so well, but they just sadly don't get past that final hurdle. I'm happy to say that the sequel on the Mega Drive does fix this. I think I accidentally said the second game was on the Amiga earlier. It wasn't, by the way. Sorry, that slipped my mind as I was talking. The only one on the Amiga is the first game. It's a good attempt. It needs a bit more tweaking, and it's one of them I sit there and think, I wonder if some sort of like hacker could come along, or Amiga coder, and readjust parts of this game, because a little bit more tweaking and we'd almost be there. Sadly, it's time to draw the show to a close. If you've enjoyed today's show or you want to leave any sort of comment, you can pop along to AMIGArama.com or drop me an email, which is lefarius@AMIGArama.com, or even pop along on Twitter, which is @AMIGAramaPod. Now, as usual, let's just take a moment to send out a huge thanks to our ongoing Patreons. They are Adam Bradley, Biggie CTZ, Graham Vebke, Glenn Milford, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Retro Ravi, Richard Legg, Sneff and Treble. And if you'd like to join them, you can come along to patreon.com/AmigaRama. Until next time.